So how do you compare the Texas Chainsaw Massacre to Dead by Daylight? They're both asymmetrical games that involve a killer chasing down a series of victims, killing them off one by one until either side either escapes or the killer wins. I think the easiest way to do this is to break it down into categories, so let's go ahead and do that. I think we'll go down category by category, and for every category that one game wins, we'll award a point. We'll do 5 categories, and then the winner will be declared as the better game, at least for now. So with that being said, let's get straight to our categories. Category 1, Style of Asymmetry. And by that, I mean that these games are both asymmetrical, but they're asymmetrical in different ways that massively affect gameplay. Category 2 will be the killer gameplay. How you play each killer, how it's effective, and how each game differs and which is ultimately more enjoyable. We'll then go to map selection, which will be judging the game's maps, seeing which are more varied, which are more fun to play on, and etc. Then we'll jump to survivor gameplay, and then finally end up on the meta game before deciding our final score. Guys, if you enjoy this sort of content, be sure to subscribe. And with that being said, let's get right into our first section. Style of Asymmetry. Enjoy. So, Style of Asymmetry. For each of these sections, by the way, we're going to be going to Texas Chainsaw Massacre first, and then Dead by Daylight second. So, TCM. Texas Chainsaw Massacre is played in a 3v4, so there are 3 killers and 4 survivors. That, in my opinion, means that the game is constantly tense due to the number of killers. It barely lets up for a single moment the entire way through. That does, however, mean that there's less team play for victims, as the victims are constantly being scattered by the killers as they're almost omnipresent and always looking. I think it also means that there's less metagame effectiveness, as the constant panic lessens the amount of strategy that is possible to accomplish because you're always panicking and always rushing. I think that what it does do, however, is it allows for much more killer teamwork and strategy, meaning that it's not just the cold metagame strategies of Dead by Daylight. It means that there's real teamwork to be made here, which means it's a whole different ballgame as to how you play. Moving on to Dead by Daylight. Dead by Daylight is played in the now what's known to be classic 1v4 gameplay formats. It means that there's less tension, but there's far more potential for strategic play as a survivor and also sort of as a killer as well. There's a lot more teamwork from the victims, as scattering with one killer is far less effective because realistically there's only one target that each killer can go after. It's impossible to separate yourself into 2 depending on most killers that you're playing. Obviously there's some plays where you can do stuff like teleporting, which also increases the chance of scattering. However, the general thesis is that with one killer there's far more strategy that you can accomplish with 4 survivors. The unique terror radius factor also adds a lot of fear and tension that you wouldn't get in a game like TCM and its yellow border, and that's because when the heartbeat commences, every neutron your brain is telling you to run. It really adds some tension, but I would say that the killer gameplay can be dull with 1v4, as the player is almost constantly alone, and this can mean that if you have an unsuccessful game, you're not going to see a single other player the entire match, and that's a really miserable experience. All in all, I would say that the Texas Chainsaw Massacre has a more unique asymmetrical style, and I think that awards it a point, because I think that its gameplay style just means that it takes the edge over a game that uses the classic style like Dead by Daylight, because it just allows for more organic gameplay. Let's move on to the killer gameplay itself. Killer gameplay is a bit more complicated than you'd think. Starting with the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, 3 killers definitely allows for more instant fun and teamwork, but in order for them to make the game fair, developers had to cut down the capabilities of each killer. See, in Dead by Daylight, it only takes 2 hits to down a survivor. In the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, it can take anywhere from 4 hits with Leatherface or 1 if you charge the chainsaw, to a massive 6, 8, even 10 if you're playing as someone like Sissy with very low savagery. It does mean though, as with 3 killers, is that You can definitely play in the strategic way of having set traps such as pincer traps, so having one killer hiding and the other one chasing. Leatherface being in the basement also means that there's time for the other killers to set up strategies and also traps. Killers' interactions with Grandpa also adds a whole other element of gameplay to those not in a chase, meaning that even if you're not on the absolute bleeding edge of a chase every 5 seconds, you've always got something to do and you've always got a goal in mind. That makes a massive difference to the fun factor, because I think being a killer in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre is fun even when you're not constantly on the chase. Dead by Daylight, however, is not the same, so let's talk about it. Dead by Daylight is a lonely game if you're a killer main. It does mean, however, that there's far more strategic gameplay that you can go for, such as perks and the metagame, and also things like looping and loop cancelling. There's far more metagame effect on how good each killer can possibly be, because even the worst killers can be transformed into absolute machines if you spec them properly. Obviously we don't know if this will be the case with TCM yet, but I can definitely see that there's less potential than there is in the killers of Dead by Daylight. The ability to stalk and chase down survivors strategically doesn't exist in TCM either, as the terror radius in Dead by Daylight can be hidden, but if you're playing as Leatherface, your chainsaw is almost always present and survivors will always be able to tell if you're close or not. Survivor sense is far stronger in TCM, and is almost always a giveaway if you're a killer. There is far more killer variety in DBD as well, just because there's so many different franchises that you can pluck killers from, whereas the Texas Chainsaw Massacre is very limited as to who could be the main killers. It's members of the family. There's not really much else to go really, but it'll be interesting to see where they go because they've already added a couple of extra ones that I really like. Maps are also far less compact on DBD, so being in a chase isn't anything like as frustrating as it can be on the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, because you have survivors doing things like hiding in holes. Overall though, I would say that this is another point to the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, as I think that being a killer is more fun moment to moment in almost every situation. In chases it's less frustrating, because you have an opportunity that another killer will catch them, or there's even ways to go around it with things like map knowledge. Looping in Dead by Daylight can be an almost immeasurable task to overcome when you're a killer who's slightly slower than the opposition anyway, depending on which killer you're playing. That being said guys, before we go on, I'd just like to give a massive thank you to every single one of you that went to my last video and either gave it a watch, liked, or even subscribed. It did incredibly well and I'm so grateful to every single one of you that take the time to watch it. With that being said guys, be sure that if you're new here, check out my last video on the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And if you liked either of these two videos, be sure to subscribe because there's more content like this coming very soon. Anyway, with that out of the way, let's go into the next section of our video, map selection. With the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, it's very difficult to imagine how the maps could be any different. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre is a game that's heavily rooted in the original concept, and I think that's a very good thing on almost every metric. However, it does heavily restrict where the developers can go in future as to new maps. With that being said, however, I do really appreciate how strongly rooted this game is in the original movies, and it goes all the way down to the minute details. I've got a friend who's massively into those films, and he can go around the map purely from his knowledge of the original. It's amazing how similar these maps are. I think that does mean that there are many similarities in every map, because before I realised that the map screens said different things before we loaded in, I didn't even realise these maps were that different. The basements all look the same, the outers look fairly similar, and I think that can be a problem for those that are really looking for variety. Speaking of variety, let's move over to Dead by Daylight to talk about those maps. But I'm just adding a side note in, I don't think the maps are bad, I really don't. I think they're great, they are fantastic maps. I'm just talking about variety here. It's map selection, not just maps. So while I'm hoping that little sub comment at the end will keep people who watch this video from hating me, let's talk about the Dead by Daylight maps. There is far far greater variety in the Dead by Daylight maps than there are in the TCM maps. Granted, this is a much older game, however, there are just so many different franchises that Dead by Daylight can plug its maps. Like, all they need to do is just go to any single map franchise and there you go, a new map is literally sitting there waiting for you. The only issue that I do have with the Dead by Daylight maps is that some of them can be incredibly frustrating, especially the indoor ones. I'd say the only indoor maps that I truly like are the ones from Saw and also the one in Raccoon City. Every other indoor map can be a little torturous, but that might just be me. Saying that, there's also infinite source material for further maps, so if you want to go any further, simply go for a new bit of source material. There you go. Game devs, are you listening? Maps are purposely designed for metagame experimentation as well, and I think that's something that we'll come back to in the last section of this video, but the metagame is everything in Dead by Daylight, for both better and for worse. So with that being said, this point goes firmly to Dead by Daylight. Let's move on to the next. Survivor gameplay. This is the mode that most people will play first when hopping into a new asymmetrical horror game. It's the game mode that really gives the strongest first impression to almost any horror game. A horror game can only be as good as how many powers you have as a victim. The killer, well, it matters enormously. It can be as overpowered or as underpowered as it's liked, but the survivor really has to be perfect. If it's not fun to survive, it can't be fun to kill. And it doesn't really work the other way around anything like as much. Just look at what I said about Dead by Daylight. Please don't hate me. Anyway, so in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the survivors are under constant pressure. This adds a lot of tension, but it lessens the possibility of team play, as I've had very few matches where sticking together has given any survival benefit or it's even been possible at any point. You'll get maybe 2 or 3 of you together in one room, the killer will come in, all hell breaks loose, you lose each other, you never find each other again, half of you die, half of you escape, or you will die. There's no real variation from that, and I don't mind it. I think it really adds a sense of like final survivor, which is actually what you look for in a horror game, really, isn't it? Like, you know those long survival horror games like Outlast, there is just some joy of being the lone survivor, and there's definitely all of that to play for here in TCM. One thing I would say though, is that it feels far more down to chance rather than skill, as it's more down to how lucky you are with the killers than your skills or map knowledge. I think this will change as the metagame becomes more and more important and people start to learn the maps more and more, but I can only judge it on what I know now. And what I know now is I felt far more lucky in this game than I have in Dead by Daylight, for both the better and for the worse. So let's talk about Dead by Daylight. When there's less pressure in Dead by Daylight, there's 100 times more strategy importance, as it's paramount to surviving. I think skill is so essential in this game that it almost makes playing as a survivor less fun. And this is coming from someone who has played hours of Dead by Daylight and far less the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. I'd say that as a newcomer to both games at some point, being a newcomer on the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, okay, it was also in the first day of when the game launched, but I would still definitely say that it was far more fun being a new survivor in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre as it was in Dead by Daylight, purely because the metagame just doesn't have as much importance. Saying that though, the team play that you have in Dead by Daylight is what makes this game so incredibly special, and I'd be absolutely insane to talk against the amount of importance that team play has in this game and by downgrading it for that reason, because the metagame has some importance. No. The metagame having importance carries far more weight as to how fun it is to playing the killer than it does to the survivor, because it's actually really fun building a team of friends around the metagame in Dead by Daylight. Like, possibility of repeatedly outplaying the killer due to superior skill is just amazing. Like, dunking on a killer in a game is something that happens so frequently as you get better in Dead by Daylight, and I know it's a bit mean, but it's just what happens, and it does feel pretty good no matter how scummy you feel when you run out at the end after having teabagged for like 30 seconds while you watch the killer slowly catch up. Escaping is far more down to perk selection and hiding or looping than chance, and for that reason, I'm giving another point to Dead by Daylight. So let's move on to our deciding round. And this will be the one that makes you either hate or love this video, if you don't either of those already. It's the metagame round. Something that I will say before we properly get into the metagame section of this video is that with the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the metagame is incredibly hard to judge. The game is so new that meta strategies simply haven't emerged yet, and when they do, I'll be sure to make an updated version of this video so that we can double check to see if this still holds true. Because it may change and it may become toxic, sort of like Dead by Daylight is nowadays. Please don't hate me for saying that, but all I'm saying is that the people who like the metagame in Dead by Daylight, like, that's why they like Dead by Daylight. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, it's much more gameplay focused and meta focused at the moment. With that being said, there is a huge amount of progression to be had in Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Every perk and ability can be leveled through playing. I think that's really important. There is very, very little sense of randomness here. If you've gone to select some sort of perk or to level your character in a certain way, it's because you chose to. And just to add to how great this feels, you can respec at any time for no cost whatsoever. I'd say that it's a much more organic and customizable form of progression than Dead by Daylight is, and Dead by Daylight is a hugely customizable form of game because the metagame strategies are almost endless in that game. But I would say here, there is actually just an element of simplicity through organic progression that there just isn't in Dead by Daylight. The one weakness of the system, however, is it relies on sustained game time playing as the same character. And in a game that forces you to swap characters if somebody else gets there before you, it can sometimes be difficult to imagine how you could possibly level up all the way without dumping constant hours into the same character by some mad form of luck. With that being said, Dead by Daylight. Let's talk metagame. In Dead by Daylight, the metagame is advanced, and it's constantly changing. Every single update to this game, there is a tweak that can completely alter how people play it. I think that's a great thing. However, I would also say that the metagame can feel cumbersome. I don't mean just heavy, because there's a lot to it, because there's also a lot to how the Texas Chainsaw Massacre's metagame is. I would say that it feels cumbersome in the way that it weighs down the gameplay. Your enjoyment of Dead by Daylight, at least after you've played your first few hours, can almost be entirely held down to your grasp of the metagame. If you understand it, you're going to love this game. If you don't, you are going to win a fraction of the time, simply because your level will be high enough that you'll be put with killers who understand it, or survivors who understand it. And if you're playing as killer, the survivors will run laps around you. And if you're playing as survivor, you've got no chance against a good killer. Put it this way, if you don't understand the metagame and don't apply meta strategies in Dead by Daylight, if you're a survivor against a nurse, you are screwed. You're screwed anyway, but you're even more screwed if you don't know the strategies they're going to play. If it's the other way around, you're going to be teabagged into infinity and oblivion. You've got no chance of killing all of them in any way, shape or form, because they will just run rings around you and you'll be incredibly frustrated. I do think the metagame is a massively appealing part of what makes Dead by Daylight so good for so many people, and I think it's why it's stuck around for so long. It's become a strategic experience that there's nothing quite like until now, but I do think that makes the game heavy with strategy, and it just makes it slightly unapproachable to people who just don't have the time to dedicate themselves to learning how it works. Like, I've watched countless videos on it, and even I don't understand how it works fully. There's only so much you can understand until you have to be naturally, you have to have the natural aptitude for this sort of game. I do think that it's a good thing, but I just think that it's way down. And for that very reason, I'm going to give this point, somewhat controversially, but I hope you'll understand, to the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And that means that our winner, by 3 points to 2, is the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. So I declare it, as of right now, the better and more enjoyable game. Obviously this can change, so let me just list a few of the reasons why I thought the Texas Chainsaw Massacre could win. I think the Texas Chainsaw Massacre wins due to its potential, and also its superior fun factor and killer gameplay. Honestly, fun factor was a massive one for me here. In Dead by Daylight, every match feels like everyone in the match is playing competitively. In the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, there's far less toxicity and abuse because nobody's really playing it that seriously. You're playing it because it's scary and fun, you're not playing it because you're trying to develop a good strategy. And while strategy will become more and more important the longer it's out, I don't think it could ever replace just how serious Dead by Daylight players feel about Dead by Daylight. It's insane. I love it and I hate it. It's so incredibly controversial to me. Anyway, I think introductions such as skill-based matchmaking will make the Texas Chainsaw Massacre far easier to recommend as an asymmetrical horror game, as it has the far more modern gameplay and graphics, and even though it's poorly explained, it has a massive fun factor for more casual players, and that's the kicker here, casual players, because let's be honest, well, you obviously can't make every change in a game to go towards and aim towards casual players. The casual players make up the majority of your audience, so if your game doesn't hit with casual players, it's never going to hit with the majority of the audience you want it to connect with, and it will never build. Like, okay, I know this is a bad example, but look at something like Hunt Showdown. Hunt Showdown is an incredible game that so many people will never play because it's simply too complicated and too weighed down by meta strategies. I love that game, I really do. I've sunk dozens of hours into it, but I can completely understand why people wouldn't like it. I've tried to get a few friends into it and they've bounced off it for that very, very reason. Anyway, I think the Dead by Daylight players, especially ones that are casual, struggle massively, as meta strategies are of huge importance and rule every aspect of how that game is played. So those who are unaware won't progress anything like as easily, and that is why I've chosen the Texas Chainsaw Massacre as the superior game. With that being said guys, what did you think of the video? Comment down below as which one's your favourite, and how you're finding the Texas Chainsaw Massacre so far, if you played Dead by Daylight, and so on. Remember to subscribe if you enjoyed. I'll be back with more Texas Chainsaw Massacre content very, very soon, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. Take care.